Okay, let's unpack this. What if I told you that a Bronze Age nomadic group, one most people have, like, never even heard of, might be the reason behind the languages we speak, how continents got populated, even like the blueprint of our DNA.
Sounds pretty wild, doesn't it? Almost sci-fi.
Totally. But that's exactly what this Epic Discovery YouTube video dives into. And honestly, it's kind of a mind blower.
It really is remarkable how fast our understanding of prehistory is changing now, with ancient DNA analysis.
Right. Before it was archaeology, linguistics. Great tools, obviously.
Invaluable, yes. But genetics just adds this whole other layer. It's revealing things we just couldn't see before.
So who are these people, the ones shaking things up? They're called the Yamnaya.
The Yamnaya, right. A nomadic culture living, over 5,000 years ago?
Yeah, roughly 3,300 to 2,600 BCE. And they didn't build stone monuments like, say, the Egyptians or Mesopotamians.
No, their legacy isn't really in stone.
It's in us, in our genes. I mean, think about that. If you have European ancestry, a big chunk of you might trace back to these steppe nomads.
Yeah.
People you probably just heard of.
It makes history incredibly personal, doesn't it?
It really does. And it ties into this huge mystery.
The Indo-European languages, yeah. Where did they all come from? English, Hindi, Greek, Latin. They're all related somehow.
For ages, that's been this massive debate for linguists, archaeologists.
And now suddenly, genetics puts the Yamnaya right in the middle of it all. They've gone from being, almost a footnote
to maybe the main character.
Exactly. That shift is fascinating.
So that Epic Discovery video, it really highlights how ancient DNA did that, how it just propelled them forward.
It's like a paradigm shift, really.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to really get into the latest genetic stuff about them. Where did they come from? How did they move so far? And how did they end up shaping modern Europe and Asia?
It's not just about old bones and potsherds.
No. It's like meeting these incredibly distant ancestors who, turns out, were massively influential.
And it's a good reminder, I think, that history isn't always about the famous empires we learn about in school.
Right. Sometimes the biggest changes come from groups we're only just starting to understand.
Precisely. The deep currents of history.
Okay, so basics first. Who are the Yamnaya? Where and when?
All right. Their heartland was the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Think massive grasslands, modern-day Ukraine, southern Russia, western Kazakhstan.
Huge area.
Immense. And the time frame is the early Bronze Age, like you said, about 3,300 to 2,600 BCE. It's an environment that just screams mobility, perfect for herding.
A world away from settled farming villages then. More like life on the move.
Exactly. Semi-nomadic pastoralism, that was their core lifestyle. Raising cattle, sheep, and critically, horses.
Which is key ingredient.
Absolutely. And they moved with the seasons, following the grazing. Totally different from cultures building permanent towns and farming the same plots year after year.
So what did they leave behind for archaeologists? The video mentioned burial mounds.
Yes, the kurgans. Those are their most distinctive feature on the landscape. Earthen mounds covering pit graves underneath.
And inside those graves.
Individuals usually buried on their backs, knees bent, sometimes with animal bones, maybe some simple pottery or tools. Nothing super flashy compared to, say, Egyptian pharaohs.
But incredibly valuable for another reason.
The DNA. These kurgans turned out to be amazing preservers of ancient genetic material, like little time capsules scattered across the steppe.
Wow. So the burials are the key to unlocking their genetic story. What else do we know? Any big cultural innovations?
Well, even without big cities, they had some game changers. First, language. It's highly likely they spoke an early form of Proto-Indo-European.
The ancestor language we mentioned, the root of so many modern tongues.
Exactly. We'll definitely circle back to that. And then there's the mastery of the horse. Not just having them, but riding them effectively.
That changes everything, doesn't it? In the early Bronze Age. Mobility, speed, managing herds.
Huge advantage for travel, scouting, warfare, everything. And it wasn't just riding. They were pioneers in using wheeled transport, too. Wagons.
Wagons.
Yeah.
Like heavy-duty carts.
Yeah. Pulled by oxen, probably, maybe horses later. They used them for long-distance migrations. These weren't just for carrying stuff. They were probably mobile homes, status symbols, maybe.
And you find bits of wagons in the graves sometimes.
We do. Remnants, yeah. Which tells you how central they were to their lives and maybe even their afterlife beliefs.
So picture these mobile communities rolling across the plains, and the video talked about a sudden and massive genetic impact. What's that about?
Okay, this is where it gets really dramatic. Around 3000 BCE, something big happens, genetically speaking.
A shift.
A massive shift. The Yamnaya start expanding rapidly west into Europe, east towards Central Asia. And it wasn't just a trickle.
Not gradual blending.
No. We're talking about a significant, relatively fast demographic wave. The genetic data shows that modern Europeans, especially in the north and east, carry a lot of Yamnaya ancestry.
How much is a lot?
Well, in some places, up to 75% of the male genetic lineage traces back to them.
75%?
Yeah!
That's huge for a group most people haven't heard of.
It's astonishing. And their genetic signature pops up in South Asia, too. It really redraws the map of ancient migrations.
Okay, so this culture was built on movement. Let's dig into that lifestyle a bit more. Horses and wagons were central.
Absolutely fundamental. Horses for the speed, the scouting, the herding efficiency over vast distances. And those heavy wooden carts, the wagons, they were essential infrastructure.
Like mobile bases?
Pretty much. Mobile homes, storage units, maybe even status symbols. Finding wagon parts in burials really drives home their importance.
Imagine that landscape. These rolling grasslands dotted with herds and these wagon-based communities. What fueled them? What do they eat?
Primarily protein and fat. Lots of meat and dairy from their herds, cattle, sheep.
Makes sense. Pastoralists.
And here's another fascinating genetic link. They seem to be among the first populations with a high frequency of the gene for lactose tolerance.
Ah, the ability to digest milk as adults.
Exactly. Something many of us take for granted now, but back then, a massive nutritional advantage. Constant source of calories and nutrients on the move probably helped fuel their expansion.
Wow. Okay. And social structure. The video mentioned fancy burials hinting at hierarchy.
Yeah, the kurgans vary in size and complexity. Some are much larger, more elaborate, with richer grave goods, inside weapons, ornaments, maybe sacrificed animals alongside the main burial.
Suggesting some people were more important than others.
It strongly implies social hierarchy, yes. Leaders, maybe powerful warriors, perhaps religious figures, people who commanded more resources and respect, even in death.
So not totally egalitarian, even in these mobile groups. What about religion, spirituality? Harder to know without writing, I guess.
Much harder. We're interpreting patterns in the archaeology, the consistent way they buried their dead orientation, bent knees, grave goods, the animal sacrifices it points to shared rituals and beliefs.
Any specific theories?
Possible ancestor veneration, maybe early forms of Indo-European myths starting to take shape. There's some evidence for fire rituals, too. It's all hints, really, piecing together a belief system from burial practices.
Fascinating detective work. And gender roles. The video mentioned differences in grave goods.
It seems so. Men are often found buried with weapons, axes, daggers, suggests roles in fighting, hunting, protection.
And women.
Sometimes buried with things like ornaments, spindle whorls, maybe suggesting textile work or other domestic-type items. It points towards distinct but probably complementary roles within their society, which makes sense for survival in that environment.
Okay, so we've got this picture. Mobile, horse-riding pastoralists, wagons, milk drinkers, social layers, specific burial rites. Now back to that genetic revolution. How did DNA analysis just blow this whole story wide open?
The big breakthrough was getting reliable DNA sequences from those skeletons in the kurgans across the steppe from different sites.
And comparing it.
Comparing it to DNA from earlier European farmers, the Neolithic people, and also the hunter-gatherers who came before them. And boom, a distinct genetic signature emerged. Scientists called it steppe ancestry.
And this was clearly linked to the Yamnaya culture, the Kurganens, and all that.
Directly linked. And the revolutionary part wasn't just finding it, it was seeing how much of it spread and how fast.
Right, you said it surged around 5,000 years ago?
Yeah, starting around 3000 BCE, it wasn't a slow trickle mixing in. In places like Central and Northern Europe, the existing gene pool, mostly those early farmers, saw massive replacement, up to 75% in some populations, within maybe just a few centuries.
75% replacement in centuries. That fundamentally changes how we think about prehistory. It's not slow, gradual change.
Not in this case, no. It implies a pretty major demographic event, a large-scale movement of people.
And not just in Europe.
No, that's the other stunner. Traces of this same Yamnaya-related ancestry show up later in South Asia, particularly among people who speak Indo-European languages there.
So genetics backs up the linguistic theory that the languages and people came from the steppe.
It provides powerful, independent evidence supporting that idea. The kind of evidence linguists had hoped for but couldn't really access before ancient DNA. It's a convergence.
What else linked the genes and the culture?
Well, you tend to find the Yamnaya genetic signature appearing alongside their cultural package. The Quran's specific pottery types, evidence of horses and mobility. It suggests people moving and bringing their whole way of life with them.
Genes and culture traveling together.
Hmm.
Makes sense. The video also mentioned a specific Y chromosome link, R1b.
Yes, haplogroup R1b on the Y chromosome, it's passed father to son. In many parts of Europe where steppe ancestry becomes dominant, R1b frequencies shoot way up.
Implying Yamnaya men were particularly successful in, well, passing on their genes.
That's the strong implication. It suggests a dynamic where incoming male lineages played a very significant role in the population turnover. Common in some migration scenarios or in societies with strong patrilineal elements, maybe warrior groups. It hints at the social dynamics.
Interesting. And the timing lines up with other changes.
Perfectly. Radiocarbon dating puts this big pulse of steppe ancestry into Europe right around 3000 DCE. That's exactly when we see older Neolithic cultures declining or transforming and new Bronze Age cultures emerging.
Like the corded ware and bell beaker cultures.
Precisely those two. And guess what? Both corded ware and bell beaker people show strong genetic links back to the Yamnaya. It all fits together remarkably well.
Wow. Okay, the genetic picture is clear. Massive migration, big impact. Let's pivot to the language connection again. How does this nomadic group from the steppe end up being the likely source of languages from Ireland to India?
Well, that's been the million-dollar question in linguistics for, centuries. You have all these languages, English, German, Russian, Greek, Latin, Persian, Hindi, dozens more that share core vocabulary, grammar.
Like the word for mother or basic number.
Exactly. Clearly related, pointing back to a common ancestor, Proto-Indo-European or PIE. But where was PI spoken? And how did it spread so incredibly far?
Lots of theories over the years, right? Anatolia, maybe?
Anatolia, modern Turkey, was a major contender. The idea that early farmers spread it out slowly. But the Yamnaya genetic evidence, this huge pulse from the steppe coinciding with the time frame these languages likely started diverging, it shifted the focus dramatically.
Back to the steppe.
Back to the Pontic-Caspian steppe as the most likely homeland. The genetics provide a mechanism, large groups of people migrating out, carrying their language with them, west into Europe, east and south towards Asia.
So the genes and the language spread together, driven by these migrations.
That's the current leading hypothesis, strongly supported by the convergence of evidence. The linguistic patterns, the archaeology of migration routes, kurgans popping up along the way, and now the genetic timelines all point to the steppe around the Yamnaya period.
Okay, so how does one language, PIE, become all these different branches? You mentioned the corded ware culture in Europe.
Right. As Yamnaya descendants moved into Europe and mixed with local populations, their language would have started changing, diverging. The corded ware culture, which arises shortly after the Yamnaya expansion and is genetically very similar.
They're seen as key.
They're widely thought to be the group associated with the diversification of the European branches. Ancestors of Germanic languages, Slavic, Celtic, Italic, maybe others too.
So English, German, French, Spanish, Russian. Their deep roots likely run through corded ware, back to the Yamnaya. Mind-boggling. What about languages like Hindi or Persian?
Similar process, but different direction. Yamnaya-related groups moved eastward and southward through Central Asia, eventually reaching Iran and the Indian subcontinent.
Carrying their language, too.
Believe so, yes. These migrations are linked to the appearance of steppe ancestry there, and are thought to have introduced early forms of Indo-Iranian languages, like Vedic Sanskrit, the ancestor of many modern Indo-Aryan languages in India.
It's incredible. One group, 5,000 years ago, and their language echoes in billions of people today. The video used the example of 3.
Yes. Words like that, basic core vocabulary showing clear relatedness across huge distances. English 3, Spanish tres, Russian trees, Greek tres, Hindi teen. It's like linguistic fossils pointing back to that common source on the steppe.
A living echo of PIE. Amazing. Now, Europe wasn't empty when they arrived. The video talked about old Europeans. What happened when these mobile pastoralists met the established farmers? Sounds like potential for clashes.
Definitely. Europe around 3000 BCE had thriving Neolithic farming cultures. They'd been there for millennia, building villages, farming land, often with complex social structures, maybe different belief systems. Evidence sometimes points to goddess figures, more communal burials.
A very different vibe from the Yamnaya warrior ethos, maybe suggested by the burials with weapons.
Potentially, yes. And when these two very different ways of life collided, it probably wasn't always smooth. Some archaeological sites from this period show signs of violence, mass graves, burned
The
villages.
direct evidence of conflict.
It's suggestive, yes.
Hmm?
And the shift in burial practices is stark. You go from communal Neolithic graves to these individual Yamnaya-style kurgans, often with weapons. It hints at disruption, maybe imposition of new customs, possibly conflict.
But it wasn't just conquest and replacement everywhere, was it? The video mentioned assimilation too.
Critically important point. While conflict likely happened, the genetics strongly show widespread mixing, intermarriage, integration. Over generations, new populations emerged that were blends of steppe Yamnaya ancestry and the older Neolithic former ancestry.
The fusion.
A fusion, exactly. And this fusion created new cultures.
Like corded ware and bellbeaker again. They weren't purely Yamnaya.
No, genetically they show both components. They seem to represent this synthesis. They might inherit Yamnaya traits like mobility, horse culture, maybe social structure, but they also adopted or retained farming practices, more settled life, maybe aspects of older beliefs from the Neolithic side.
A hybrid vigor, culturally speaking.
You could see it that way. They were adapting, creating something new out of the encounter between these different traditions.
And language-wise, how did PIE become dominant if there was mixing?
That's complex. It likely wasn't instantaneous. But perhaps the language of the incoming Yamnaya-related groups held some social prestige or was associated with their success, maybe their elite structures. Over generations, through bilingualism and language shift, it seems Proto-Indo-European gradually replaced many of the older non-Indo-European languages spoken by the Neolithic farmers.
But the Yamnaya must have adapted too, right? Moving into forests or wetter parts of Europe.
Absolutely. They weren't static. As they moved into new environments, they would have learned from local populations, adapted their herding practices, maybe adopted more agriculture where it made sense. It was a two-way street of adaptation.
So, not a simple story of invaders wiping everyone out, more like a complex, sometimes violent, but ultimately transformative process of interaction, mixing, and creating something new.
Precisely, leading to a genetically and culturally much more diverse Europe than before. A synthesis.
Okay, let's talk about that enduring genetic legacy. The video called it astonishing. Just how much Yamnaya DNA is floating around today.
The scale is really impressive. As we've touched on, ancient DNA reveals this consistent Yamnaya genetic thread across pretty much all of Europe, especially strong in Central and Northern Europe.
But detectable elsewhere.
Detectable widely, yes, and even traces into the Middle East and, significantly, South Asia.
The video put a figure on it for Europeans.
Yeah.
Up to 50%.
In many modern European populations, yes, up to half their ancestry can trace back directly to these Bronze Age steppe migrations. It's a foundational component of the modern European gene pool.
Half. That's incredible. Any specific examples? Like Britain?
Britain is a striking case study. The arrival of the Bellbeaker people, who carried substantial Yamnaya ancestry around 4,500 years ago, led to a massive population replacement. Something like 90% of the existing Neolithic gene pool was replaced over a few centuries.
90%. Wow.
Yeah, huge turnover. We see similar, maybe not quite as extreme, but still very significant contributions across Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, even reaching Iberia.
And back to South Asia. This wasn't just a European phenomena.
No. The later migrations around 2000 BCE, carrying steppe ancestry into northern India, had a major impact there too, contributing significantly to the genetic landscape and, as we discussed, likely linked to the spread of Indo-Aryan languages.
Beyond just ancestry percentages, did they bring specific traits? The video mentioned height, skin color, that lactose tolerance again.
There's growing evidence for that. Studies suggest that alleles genetic variants associated with increased height, possibly lighter skin pigmentation, certain immune system responses, and definitely lactose persistence, tolerance, became much more common in Europe following the steppe migrations.
So they didn't just change who lived where. They might have literally changed the physical characteristics of European populations over time.
It appears so, yes. They contributed genes that were then favored by natural selection in European environments or were simply carried along by their demographic success. Lactose tolerance is the clearest example.
So we are, in a very real sense, living echoes of these people. Their genes are woven into millions, maybe billions, of us across continents.
It's a profound connection to the deep past, revealed by this new science. Their legacy is alive within us.
Which really drives home how much ancient DNA has rewritten history. The video contrasted it with traditional archaeology. How big a shift has it been?
It's been revolutionary. Archaeology gives us the what and where, the artifacts, the sites, the cultural changes, but it often struggled with the who and how of population movements. Were these ideas spreading or people moving?
Right, the old debate. Cultural diffusion versus demic diffusion, meaning actual migration.
Exactly. Ancient DNA gives us a direct window into demic diffusion, and in the case of the Yamnaya, it showed massive, relatively rapid migrations were happening on a scale many archaeologists hadn't previously thought likely for this period.
Challenging the idea that prehistoric change was always slow and gradual.
Absolutely. The Yamnaya story is one of dynamism's swift expansion out from the steppe, starting around 3300 BCE, reaching far into Europe and Asia within centuries, causing major population turnovers. That picture comes primarily from the genetics.
So interpretations of things like the corded ware culture changed.
Dramatically. What might have been seen as local developments with some steppe influence are now understood as being driven by substantial migrations from the steppe. Same for the Indo-Iranian movements eastward. Genetics provided the demographic engine for these cultural shifts.
It sounds like these migrations were truly transformative then, creating new cultures, spreading languages, forging new genetic identities through mixing.
They really were. They fundamentally reshaped the cultural and biological landscape of a huge swath of Eurasia. And the way geneticists and linguists can now work together using DNA to trace the journey of both people and language from the steppe. That's incredibly powerful.
But it's still complex, right? Not just one monolithic Yamnaya wave.
Definitely not. The Yamnaya themselves likely weren't uniform, and their interactions varied. Sometimes maybe more dominance, other times more gradual mixing and integration. It wasn't a single event, but a complex process over centuries, unfolding differently in different regions. The past is always nuanced.
But overall, the study of Yamnaya DNA has given us this much clearer, more dynamic picture of prehistory, a world more connected and mobile than we perhaps realized.
Unquestionably. It's opened a window onto the scale and impact of ancient migrations and placed the Yamnaya right at the heart of a pivotal chapter in human history, a chapter we're still learning to read.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, it's pretty clear, isn't it? The Yamnaya people, these nomads from the Eurasian steppe 5,000 years ago, they had this incredible lasting impact.
Absolutely. On our genes, the languages we speak, how Europe and parts of Asia are populated. It's profound.
And what gets me is, like the video pointed out, they weren't famous empire builders in the traditional sense. No huge pyramids or written records dominating history books.
Yet their legacy, carried by people, by genes, by language, might be even more widespread and fundamental. It really speaks to the power of migration, mobility, and cultural transmission in shaping who we are.
It's definitely an aha moment. Realizing this group you likely never heard of before is potentially a direct ancestor and a source of the language family you speak. It changes your perspective.
It connects you to deep history in a very tangible way. And the story isn't finished, of course.
Right. Science keeps moving. More ancient DNA, more analysis. We'll keep learning more about the Yamnaya and their world.
No doubt revealing even more complexity and detail.
So here's a final thought to leave folks with. Think about how the Yamnaya mastering the horse, developing wagons, seemingly practical innovations. How that set off this chain reaction. Migrations, cultural mixing, language spread, reshaping continents.
Small changes, huge consequences, ripples through time.
Exactly. So what other seemingly small things from the deep past, maybe innovations we haven't even recognized yet, might hold similarly profound legacies, still shaping our world in ways we don't fully grasp? Makes you wonder, doesn't it?